My mom works so hard, but her boss won't pay her. Jonathan Reed studied the little girl standing beside his table for a moment. Hey there, he said gently. Are you talking to me? The girl nodded. You sure you meant to say that to me? Jonathan asked. Yes. Jonathan glanced toward the counter. Well, he said calmly, if there's a problem at work, that's something you should probably tell the owner of the cafe. He gestured toward the bar. You see the man behind the counter? Blue shirt. That's the boss. The little girl nodded. That's him. Jonathan frowned slightly. You mean the boss who isn't paying your mom? Yes, the little girl said, her voice fading. Behind the espresso machine stood Ethan Cole. Ethan laughed with a regular customer while stacking paper cups beside the register. Jonathan slowly leaned back in his chair again. For a moment he didn't say anything. Jonathan looked back at the girl. Your mom works here? Yes. He nodded toward the tables. Which one is she? The girl turned and pointed across the cafe. A woman moved quickly between tables carrying a tray of drinks. She wore a black apron tied around her waist and a gray shirt beneath it. Her hair had been pulled into a loose bun, though several strands had slipped free. Even from a distance, Jonathan could see the fatigue in her shoulders. She placed 2 coffees on a table and hurried back toward the counter before the next order was ready. That's my mom, the girl said. Jonathan watched her carefully. Jonathan looked back at the girl. And you're telling me he hasn't paid her? The girl shook her head. He keeps saying next week. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Next week? Then the week after. Jonathan folded his hands on the table. How long has this been going on? The girl looked down at the floor, thinking, 5 weeks. Jonathan exhaled slowly. 5 weeks. That wasn't a delay. That was something else. He looked back toward Ethan again. 20 years of friendship. 20 years of coffee conversations. Jonathan turned back to the girl. Well, he said gently, I'm sorry your mom is having a hard time. She didn't answer. Jonathan continued carefully, but that's something your mom needs to work out with her boss. He nodded toward the counter again. I know it might be difficult, but it's not really my responsibility. The girl listened quietly. Jonathan gave a polite shrug. I'm just a customer sitting here drinking coffee. She looked down and then continued speaking. My mom tried to ask him. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. And what happened? He said next week. Jonathan sighed quietly. And after that? He said the same thing again. Across the cafe, her mother carried another tray toward a table near the door. One of the cups nearly slid off when someone bumped the chair beside her. She caught it just in time. Behind the counter, Ethan glanced over. The girl shifted her weight. My mom says maybe he thinks she'll stop asking. Jonathan didn't answer. Then the girl added something else. If she doesn't get the money soon, we might lose our apartment. Jonathan looked back at her. What do you mean? The girl spoke carefully, like someone repeating something she had heard adults say many times. The rent is due. Jonathan's expression tightened slightly. And if she can't pay it? The girl shrugged. The landlord said we can't stay. The sounds of the cafe seemed quieter now. How long before the rent is due? He asked. 3 days. Jonathan rubbed his thumb lightly along the edge of the coffee mug. The girl looked up at him again. My mom works every day, she said softly. Jonathan didn't interrupt. She wakes up early, the girl continued, and she comes home late. Across the cafe, the woman wiped down a table near the window. Jonathan watched her carefully. Then he looked back down at the girl. What's your mom's name? He asked. Monica. Jonathan nodded slowly. And what's your name? Annie. Well, Annie, Jonathan said quietly. Why did you come tell me? The girl pointed again toward the counter. You were sitting with him. Jonathan followed her gaze. Ethan stood behind the bar, chatting comfortably with a customer. You're friends, Annie said. Jonathan hesitated. Yes, he admitted. She continued. I thought maybe you could help. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. You think he'll listen to me? Annie nodded. You're his friend. Jonathan didn't respond right away. He looked across the cafe again. Monica hurried past another table with a tray in her hands. Her shoulders sagged slightly as she turned back toward the counter. Jonathan slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. Annie watched him. Jonathan adjusted his jacket sleeve and looked toward the counter where Ethan continued talking with customers, completely unaware of the conversation happening across the room. Jonathan glanced down at the girl. Stay here for a minute, he said calmly. Annie nodded. Okay. Jonathan began walking toward the counter. Because sometimes the difference between ignoring a problem and confronting it is just the moment someone decides to stand up. Jonathan Reed walked slowly across the cafe floor, but Jonathan's attention was fixed on one place, the counter. Ethan Cole stood there with a relaxed smile, chatting with a customer while wiping his hands on a towel. He looked completely at ease, like a man running a place that had become part of the neighborhood. Jonathan had known Ethan for nearly 20 years. They had met when both of them were young and ambitious, trying to figure out what their lives were going to become. Ethan had always talked about opening cafes. Jonathan had been writing code in a cramped apartment, building a software company that nobody believed would go anywhere. Life had taken them in different directions since then. Jonathan eventually sold that company for more money than he had ever imagined earning when he was younger. Ethan had built this cafe, a comfortable little corner of Chicago where regular customers felt at home. Jonathan had always respected that. Now he stepped up to the counter. Ethan noticed him immediately. "Hey, John," Ethan said with a grin. "Sorry about that call earlier." Jonathan didn't return the smile. Ethan noticed the change right away. "What's up?" he asked. Jonathan rested one hand on the counter. "I need to ask you something." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Sure," Jonathan spoke calmly. "How long has Monica been working here?" Ethan blinked. "Monica?" "The waitress. Gray shirt." Ethan glanced across the cafe floor. "Oh, hair." He shrugged. "A couple months, maybe." Jonathan's voice remained steady. "And you haven't paid her." For a moment, Ethan just stared at him. Then he laughed softly. "Is that what this is about?" Jonathan didn't laugh. "Is it true?" Ethan leaned back against the counter and folded his arms. "Payroll's delayed," he said casually. "For 5 weeks?" Ethan waved his hand as if brushing the issue aside. "Things happen, John. Small business stuff." Jonathan held his gaze. "She says you keep telling her next week." Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "You talking to her now?" Jonathan didn't answer the question. Instead, he glanced across the room. The little girl was still standing near Jonathan's table exactly where he had left her. She watched the conversation carefully, her small face serious as she followed every movement. Jonathan turned back toward Ethan. "I spoke with her daughter." Ethan followed Jonathan's gaze across the cafe. "Oh." For a brief moment, something uncomfortable crossed his face. Then he sighed. "Look, John, you know how this works. Restaurants don't run like your tech companies. Money comes in waves." Jonathan's voice remained quiet. "She's working every day." Ethan shrugged. "She agreed to the job." Jonathan didn't move. "And you agreed to pay her." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "You're getting the story from one side." Jonathan watched him carefully. "Then tell me the other side." Ethan sighed again. "She missed a few shifts early on. We're balancing things out." Jonathan frowned slightly. "You're withholding 5 weeks of pay because she missed shifts?" Ethan spread his hands. "It's more complicated than that." Jonathan glanced toward the cafe floor again. Monica moved quickly between tables carrying a tray of drinks. She placed 2 cups down near the window and immediately turned back toward the counter. Jonathan watched her shoulders sag slightly before she straightened again and kept moving. Then he looked back at Ethan. "She told her daughter they might lose their apartment." Ethan frowned. "And?" Jonathan stared at him. "The rent is due in 3 days." Ethan shifted uncomfortably but quickly masked it. "That's not my responsibility." The words hung between them. Jonathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked around the cafe. Jonathan turned back to Ethan. "How much do you owe her?" Ethan crossed his arms again. "That's none of your business." Jonathan's voice stayed calm. 5 weeks. Ethan rolled his eyes. "You're really going to do this?" Jonathan said nothing. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "John, we're friends. Don't turn this into something weird." Jonathan studied his old friend carefully. Across the cafe, Monica reached for another tray and nearly dropped it when someone brushed past her chair. She caught it at the last second. Jonathan saw the moment of panic in her face before she forced herself to keep moving. He turned back to Ethan. "You know she has a child watching her work right now." Ethan glanced over again. "So?" Jonathan's voice lowered. "She's exhausted." Ethan sighed impatiently. "That's the job." Jonathan leaned a little closer across the counter. "No," he said quietly. "Not without pay." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Are you threatening me over a waitress?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the room again. The little girl hadn't moved. She was still watching them. Jonathan remembered the way she had said it. "If she doesn't get the money soon, we might lose our apartment." Jonathan turned back toward Ethan. "You've known me a long time," he said quietly. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah. You know I usually stay out of other people's business." "That's right." Jonathan's voice remained calm, but something in it had changed. But I don't like watching someone work themselves into the ground while the person who owes them money pretends it's not a problem. Ethan stared at him. Jonathan continued, "So, I'll ask you again." The cafe seemed to quiet slightly around them. "When are you going to pay her?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could answer, something crashed behind them. Both men turned. Across the cafe floor, Monica stood frozen. A tray lay on the ground beside her. Broken cups scattered across the wooden floor while coffee spread outward in dark streaks. The room fell silent. Monica looked pale, one hand gripping the edge of a table as if she needed it to stay standing. Jonathan immediately understood what had happened. She was simply too tired, too exhausted to keep going. Near the table, the little girl took a small step forward. "Mom?" she said softly. "If this moment touched your heart, take a second to support the story. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you are watching from. And if you believe stories about fairness and standing up for others matter, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story." Jonathan looked from the spilled coffee, to Monica, to Ethan, and something inside him settled into a decision. He slowly removed his jacket and placed it over the back of a nearby chair. Then he turned back toward the counter. "Ethan," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "We're not finished talking." For a moment, the entire cafe went silent. The crash of the tray still echoed faintly in the room. Broken ceramic cups lay scattered across the wooden floor, while dark coffee spread slowly between the chair legs. Monica stood frozen beside the mess. Her breathing was uneven. One hand gripped the edge of a nearby table as if she needed it to stay upright. A few strands of hair had fallen loose across her face, and her shoulders trembled slightly. Customers stared. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others glanced awkwardly at one another, unsure whether to speak. Near Jonathan's table, Annie had stepped forward. "Mom?" she said quietly. Her voice was small, but it carried across the room. Monica turned her head at the sound. When she saw her daughter standing there, something in her expression broke. Not anger, not embarrassment. Exhaustion. Pure exhaustion. "I'm okay," she said quickly. Though the words sounded thin, she tried to bend down to pick up the broken cups, but as she crouched, she paused for a second and pressed a hand against her temple. Jonathan noticed it immediately. Across the counter, Ethan groaned. "Oh, come on," he muttered under his breath. "Not during the morning rush." Jonathan slowly turned his head toward him. "You're worried about the rush?" Ethan shrugged impatiently. She dropped half the orders. Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped away from the counter and walked toward Monica. The cafe floor felt strangely quiet now. Customers watched him cross the room, curiosity spreading through the tables like a ripple. Monica had already knelt down, gathering pieces of the broken cups into a small pile. "I'm sorry," she said to no one in particular. "I'll clean it up." Jonathan crouched down beside her. "Don't worry about that," he said calmly. Monica looked up, surprised. For a second, she didn't seem to recognize him. Then she did. "Oh, sir, I'm sorry about earlier," she said quickly. "Your coffee will be ready soon." Jonathan shook his head. "I'm not worried about the coffee." Monica looked confused. Annie had moved closer now, standing beside the table where her mother knelt. "Mom," she whispered. Monica glanced at her daughter, then back at Jonathan. "I'll take care of this," she said quietly, still reaching for the broken pieces. Jonathan gently slid the tray out of her hands. "You look like you need to sit down." Monica immediately shook her head. "I can't." "Why not?" She hesitated. Then she glanced toward the counter where Ethan stood watching. "I'm still on shift." Jonathan looked at her carefully. "You've been working all morning. And yesterday. And the day before," Annie added softly. Monica gave her daughter a quick look. "Annie, honey," but Annie continued anyway. "She worked late last night too." Monica closed her eyes briefly. Jonathan stood up slowly. "Sit down for a minute," he said. "I really can't," Monica repeated. Jonathan didn't argue. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward the counter. "Ethan," the name carried across the cafe. Ethan sighed loudly and walked toward them. Customers watched the scene unfold with growing interest. "What now?" Ethan said when he reached them. Jonathan stepped aside slightly. "Look at her." Ethan glanced down at Monica, who was still kneeling beside the broken cups. "She dropped a tray," he said flatly. "It happens." Jonathan's voice stayed calm. She can barely stand. Ethan shrugged. She's working a shift. Monica finally stood up slowly. I'm fine, she said quickly. Her voice wavered slightly. I just lost my grip for a second. Jonathan looked at her closely. Have you eaten today? Monica hesitated. Yes. Annie spoke quietly beside her. She didn't. Monica's eyes widened. Annie? Jonathan turned toward the girl. You're sure? She said we should save money. The words were simple, but the room had grown so quiet that several nearby customers heard them clearly. Jonathan turned back to Ethan. Ethan looked uncomfortable now. You really going to turn this into a scene? He said under his breath. Jonathan's expression remained calm. You already did. Ethan crossed his arms. John, I told you I'll handle the payroll. When? Ethan didn't answer. Jonathan looked back at Monica. How many hours have you worked this week? Monica looked down at the floor. I'm not sure. Annie answered. A lot. Jonathan nodded slightly. Then he turned back toward Ethan. You owe her 5 weeks of pay. Ethan's patience snapped. Why are you acting like this is your business? Jonathan's voice remained steady. Because her daughter came to my table asking for help. Several customers turned their heads toward Annie. The girl looked uncomfortable now but didn't move. Ethan rubbed his face. She shouldn't be bothering customers. Jonathan replied quietly. She wasn't bothering anyone. Ethan lowered his voice. John, let's not do this in front of everyone. Jonathan looked around the cafe. People were pretending not to stare now, but they were listening. Jonathan turned back to Ethan. Then answer the question. Ethan's jaw tightened. What question? Jonathan spoke slowly. When are you going to pay her? The room felt even quieter now. Monica stood completely still. Annie held her mother's hand. Ethan looked from Jonathan to Monica, to the customers watching, and for the first time that morning, the confidence on his face was gone. Ethan looked from Jonathan to Monica, then briefly toward the tables nearest the window where 2 customers had stopped pretending not to listen. His face changed in small stages. First irritation, then calculation, then something closer to embarrassment, though it didn't stay long enough to become remorse. Not here, he said at last. Jonathan held his gaze. Here is exactly where it belongs. Ethan glanced around the room again, aware now of how many eyes were on him. This is a private payroll matter. Jonathan's expression didn't change. A woman worked in your cafe for 5 weeks without a paycheck. Her daughter just told me they may lose their apartment in 3 days. That stopped being private when it started destroying their lives. Monica lowered her eyes. Please, she said softly. I don't want trouble. Jonathan turned to her. You didn't create this. Monica looked like she wanted to believe him. But years of living close to the edge had trained something else into her. People like her did not get to be the center of a room without paying for it later. Ethan exhaled sharply. Can we go to the back office? Jonathan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Fine. He bent and picked up a clean chair from a nearby table, setting it beside the wall for Monica. Sit down, he said. I'm okay. No, you're not. The words were gentle, but they landed with enough certainty that Monica didn't argue this time. She sat slowly, one hand still pressed lightly to her temple. Annie stood beside her knee, fingers curled around the side of the chair. Jonathan looked toward one of the younger baristas behind the counter. Can you bring her a glass of water and something to eat? The girl behind the register blinked, then nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Ethan made a small sound of annoyance. Jonathan turned his head. Don't. There was nothing loud in the word, but Ethan heard enough in it to stay quiet. The water came first, then a paper plate with a toasted bagel cut in half. Monica looked at it as if food had become something unfamiliar. Please, Jonathan said. She took the water with trembling fingers. Ethan jerked his head toward the hallway near the back. Office. Jonathan followed him without hurry. The office was small, windowless, and warmer than the cafe floor. A desk sat against the wall beneath a corkboard cluttered with schedules, receipts, and vendor invoices. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds and printer toner. Ethan shut the door. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Then Ethan turned around. What exactly do you think you're doing? Jonathan remained standing, asking a question you keep avoiding. Ethan laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You walk into my place, hear half a story from a kid, and suddenly you're the judge? Jonathan folded his hands loosely in front of him. I asked you when you were going to pay her. You still haven't answered. Ethan moved behind the desk. then thought better of sitting. He remained standing too. "You want the truth?" he said. "The truth is this place has had a rough quarter." Jonathan said nothing. Costs went up. Supply prices, labor, utilities, all of it. A few bad months, a pipe issue in the basement, a refrigerator replacement I didn't plan for. Then 2 corporate accounts cut back their orders. He spread his hands. "That's the truth." Jonathan's face stayed unreadable. "So your solution was to stop paying one of your employees." "I was buying time. With her money." Ethan's jaw tightened. "With money I plan to replace." Jonathan looked at him quietly. "That sentence sounds better in your head than it does out loud." Ethan looked away for a moment, irritated by how true that was. "She's not the only one who got paid late." Jonathan caught the shift instantly. "But she got paid nothing." Ethan didn't answer. Jonathan continued, "Because she's the one you believed would keep showing up." Ethan's eyes flicked back to him. "That's not fair." "No," Jonathan said. "What's not fair is knowing someone's desperate enough to keep working and using that against them." Ethan walked to the corkboard and pulled down a paper, more to move than because he needed it. He tossed it back on the desk. "You don't understand what it's like to keep a small business alive." Jonathan almost smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You still think I was born sitting in boardrooms?" Ethan said nothing. Jonathan looked past him, but not at the room. Somewhere much older had opened in his mind. A narrow apartment. A winter coat hanging by the door. His mother standing at a sink with chapped hands after cleaning houses all day. She had once taken a bus across town to ask for wages a man kept postponing because he knew she needed the work too badly to make a scene. "I remember how she came home that night," Jonathan thought. Not angry, just smaller somehow. He looked back at Ethan. "I understand more than you think." Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "I was going to pay her." "When?" "This week. You told her that last week." Ethan didn't answer. Jonathan took one slow breath. "Did you intend to pay her before rent came due?" Ethan's silence was its own answer. Jonathan's voice grew even quieter. "Did you know about the rent?" Ethan hesitated. Then, because he had known Jonathan too long to lie badly, he said, "She mentioned it." The room felt smaller after that. Jonathan took a step forward. "And you still let her work?" Ethan's defensiveness flared again. Maybe because shame had become unbearable. "She chose to stay." Jonathan stared at him. "No," he said. "She chose to survive." Ethan looked away. The old friendship between them seemed suddenly visible in the room only as absence. It was there in the years behind them, in all the coffee meetings and remembered stories. But it no longer had weight enough to help either one now. Jonathan spoke at last. "How much do you owe her?" Ethan gave a tired laugh. "You won't let that go." "No." Ethan walked back to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder. He flipped through a stack of timesheets, then stopped. 4,800 and change, he muttered. Jonathan's eyes settled on the number. 5 weeks, he said. Ethan set the folder down harder than necessary. "You think I'm proud of this?" Jonathan answered without hesitation. "I think pride stopped guiding you a while ago." Ethan flinched slightly at that. Outside the office, the muffled sounds of the cafe had resumed. Orders being called out, chairs moving, the world continuing, as it always did, around private disgrace. Jonathan looked at the folder. "Can you pay it today?" Ethan hesitated. That was all Jonathan needed. "You can't." Ethan crossed his arms. "Not all of it." "How much?" "Maybe half, maybe less until Friday." Jonathan's expression hardened for the first time. "You knew she was behind on rent." Ethan snapped back. "I knew she needed the job." Jonathan held his gaze until the meaning of that sentence arrived in the room and settled there between them. Ethan heard it too. The ugliness of it. The truth he had accidentally spoken in plain English. Jonathan reached for the folder and closed it. "When a man starts treating another person's fear like an asset," he said quietly, "he's already in deeper trouble than he realizes." Ethan looked at him. And for the first time that morning he seemed uncertain not about cash flow, not about payroll, but about Jonathan himself. "What are you going to do?" Jonathan turned toward the door. "That depends on what you do in the next 10 minutes. He opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. On the cafe floor, Monica was still seated. Annie stood close beside her. The bagel sat half-eaten in Monica's lap, and there was a kind of shame in the way she held it, as though even hunger needed apology. Jonathan stopped for a second and looked at them. Then he looked at Ethan, who had followed him out of the office. The next part, he knew, would happen in front of everyone. When Jonathan stepped back onto the cafe floor, the conversations that had slowly resumed began fading again. People had tried to return to their coffee and laptops, but curiosity had already rooted itself in the room. A few customers looked down at their cups, pretending not to watch. Others didn't bother pretending at all. Monica still sat in the chair Jonathan had brought her. The glass of water was half empty in her hand. Annie stood beside her, one arm resting lightly against her mother's shoulder. Jonathan noticed the way Monica straightened slightly when he returned, as if she expected to be told to get back to work. Ethan stepped out behind him. Immediately, his voice shifted into the confident tone of a business owner regaining control of his space. "All right, everyone," he said, clapping his hands once. "Little accident. Nothing to worry about. We'll get the orders moving again." One of the baristas nodded quickly and turned back toward the espresso machine. Customers exchanged quiet glances. Jonathan remained standing beside Monica's chair. Ethan noticed. "John," he said under his breath, "let's not keep doing this." Jonathan didn't lower his voice. "You owe her $4,800. The number landed like a dropped glass. Two customers near the window froze mid-conversation. A man in a suit slowly lowered his coffee cup back to the table. Ethan's face hardened instantly. "We talked about this." Jonathan's tone remained even. "Yes, we did." Ethan glanced around the room again. The quiet attention now pressing in on him was not something he enjoyed. "Payroll is a private matter," he said. Jonathan nodded slightly. "Then you should have handled it privately 5 weeks ago." The words carried through the cafe. Monica looked down at her hands. "Please," she whispered. "I don't want this." Jonathan crouched slightly so his voice reached her without carrying across the room. "You didn't cause it, but I work here." Jonathan glanced toward Ethan. "That's the problem." Ethan's patience snapped. "John, enough." Jonathan stood again. "You told me you could maybe pay half today." Ethan's eyes flashed. "That conversation was in my office, and now we're on the cafe floor." For a moment, neither man moved. Then Ethan turned slightly toward Monica. "You can go home for the day," he said. Monica blinked in surprise. I still have hours left." I said go home. The words sounded generous at first, but there was something sharp underneath them. Jonathan heard it immediately. "Paid." Ethan looked at him. "What? You're sending her home. Is she being paid?" Ethan hesitated. Monica quickly spoke up. "It's okay. I can stay." Jonathan shook his head gently. "You shouldn't." Annie looked up at him. "My mom can work," she said quietly. Jonathan crouched again so he was level with her. "I know she can." He paused. "But sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stop." Annie studied his face as if weighing the meaning of that sentence. Behind them, Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Fine," he said impatiently. "I'll give her something." Jonathan turned slowly. "Something?" Ethan opened the register drawer and pulled out a stack of bills. He counted quickly, then walked over and held the money out. 2,000, he said. Monica stared at it. Her fingers didn't move. "That covers the week," Ethan added. Jonathan didn't look at the money. "That covers less than half of what you owe." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's what I can do today." Jonathan watched him carefully. "Or what you're willing to do today." The distinction hung between them. Monica finally reached for the cash, her hand shaking slightly. Jonathan gently placed a hand over the bills before she could take them. "Wait." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You're not her accountant." "No," Jonathan said quietly. "But I'm the reason she's about to accept less than she earned." Monica looked confused. "What do you mean?" Jonathan looked at her. "If I hadn't said anything, would he be handing you that money right now?" Monica didn't answer. She didn't need to. Ethan scoffed. "You're turning charity into a lecture." Jonathan finally picked up the stack of bills and held them for a moment. Then he handed them to Monica. "This is part of what you earned," he said. She looked down at the money, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonathan shook his head gently. "You don't thank people for paying a debt." Across the room, a man near the window nodded slightly without meaning to. Ethan noticed the gesture. His discomfort deepened. "John," he said sharply, "if you've made your point, we can move on." Jonathan studied him for a moment. "You told me earlier you might have the rest by Friday." "Yes." Jonathan slipped a hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Good." Ethan frowned. "What are you doing?" Jonathan opened a banking app calmly. Solving a timing problem. Ethan watched him. Jonathan tapped the screen for a few seconds. Then he looked at Monica. Do you have a bank account? She hesitated. Yes. Good. Ethan crossed his arms. You're not serious. Jonathan looked up. You owe her $4,800. He turned the phone slightly so Ethan could see the screen. I'm transferring the rest right now. Monica's eyes widened. No, you don't have to do that. Jonathan's voice stayed calm. I know. Ethan stared at him. You think that makes you some kind of hero? Jonathan met his gaze. No. He pressed confirm on the transfer. I think it makes the rent possible. The phone chimed softly. Jonathan lowered it. Monica looked stunned. Annie squeezed her mother's hand. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment, then back at Jonathan. You just paid my employee. Jonathan nodded once. Temporary loan. Ethan frowned. Lawn. Jonathan slipped the phone back into his pocket. You still owe the money. The meaning settled slowly. Ethan realized what had just happened. Jonathan had not rescued Monica. He had simply moved the debt from Monica to him. The cafe had gone quiet again. Jonathan looked at Ethan one last time. You now owe me $4,800. Ethan's face hardened. And unlike Monica, Jonathan added quietly, I don't wait 5 weeks. Annie looked up at him with wide eyes. Monica was still staring at the money in her hands. And across the cafe floor, several customers were watching Ethan in a very different way than they had 20 minutes earlier. For several seconds after Jonathan spoke, no one in the cafe said a word. The espresso machine hissed once behind the counter, loud in the silence, then clicked off again. Ethan stood still, staring at Jonathan as if trying to decide whether the moment had actually happened. You can't be serious, he said finally. Jonathan looked at him calmly. I already transferred it. Ethan let out a short laugh, but there was tension under it now. So what now, you're my banker? No, Jonathan replied. I'm your reminder. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Reminder of what? Jonathan's voice stayed quiet. That debts don't disappear just because the person you owe is too tired to fight. Monica still sat in the chair beside the wall. She looked from Jonathan to Ethan and back again, as if the entire exchange had moved too fast for her to catch up. Annie tugged gently at her sleeve. Mom? Monica blinked, then looked down at the stack of bills in her hands. I don't understand, she said softly. Jonathan turned toward her. You were owed money, he said. Now you have it. But you paid it. Yes. Monica shook her head slowly. That's not right. Jonathan crouched slightly so he was eye level with her. What wouldn't be right, he said gently, is you losing your home because someone else decided to delay your paycheck. She swallowed. You don't even know us. Jonathan gave a faint smile. I know enough. Across the cafe, 2 older customers near the window exchanged quiet glances. One of them, a gray-haired man in a tweed jacket, nodded once toward Jonathan, as if acknowledging something he respected. Ethan noticed that too, and he hated it. He walked back toward the counter, then turned sharply again. This whole performance, he said. You think it makes you look noble? Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to a nearby table and picked up the chair he had moved earlier, sliding it back into place. Then he looked at Ethan. It wasn't a performance. Ethan scoffed. You made sure everyone heard. Jonathan shrugged slightly. You made sure everyone saw. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. Behind the counter, the younger baristas worked more quietly now. One of them avoided looking directly at Ethan. Another customer approached the register slowly, glancing between the 2 men before placing an order. The atmosphere of the cafe had changed, not loudly, but noticeably. Reputation, Jonathan knew, rarely cracked all at once. It fractured quietly, hairline lines spreading through the surface before anyone admitted the structure had weakened. Ethan leaned against the counter. You really think people will remember this by tomorrow? Jonathan looked around the room. People remember how a place makes them feel. Ethan said nothing. Jonathan continued. And right now your cafe feels different. That truth settled uncomfortably into the room. Near the wall, Monica finally stood up slowly. I should go, she said. Jonathan looked at her. You should rest. She nodded faintly. I will. Annie held her hand as they walked toward the door. But before reaching it, Monica turned back. Mr. Jonathan answered gently. Jonathan. She hesitated. Mr. Jonathan, I will pay you back. Jonathan shook his head. You don't owe me anything. But you said. I said Ethan owes me. Monica looked uncertain. That money is yours. Her eyes filled slightly, though she tried not to show it. People don't usually do things like that. Jonathan gave a small smile. They used to. For a moment she studied his face, as if trying to understand the kind of man who could say something like that without sounding proud. Then she nodded once. "Thank you," she whispered. This time Jonathan didn't correct her. Sometimes gratitude wasn't about debts. Sometimes it was simply the only language people had left. Monica and Annie stepped outside into the pale winter sunlight. The door closed behind them. Inside the cafe, Ethan exhaled sharply. "Well," he muttered. "That was dramatic." Jonathan turned toward him. "You're worried about drama. I'm worried about business." Jonathan nodded toward the window. "You should be." Ethan followed his gaze. Outside, Monica and Annie had stopped on the sidewalk. Annie said something that made Monica smile weakly for the first time that morning. Ethan shook his head. "You don't understand small business." Jonathan leaned lightly against the back of a chair. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Jonathan studied him for a moment. "Let me ask you something." Ethan folded his arms. "What? How long have you owned this cafe?" 12 years. "And in 12 years," Jonathan said quietly, "how many people worked here who trusted you to treat them fairly?" Ethan hesitated. Jonathan continued. "You built this place on relationships." "Exactly. And today," Jonathan said, "you spent one." Ethan's jaw tightened again. "Don't lecture me." Jonathan looked toward the door where Monica and Annie had disappeared down the street. "Your problem isn't cash flow." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Jonathan met his eyes. "It means the money isn't the most expensive thing you lost today." Ethan didn't respond. For the first time since Jonathan had arrived that morning, uncertainty flickered in his expression. Jonathan checked the time on his watch. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. Ethan watched him carefully. "What now?" Jonathan typed a short message. Then he slipped the phone away. "Just taking care of something." "What?" Jonathan looked at him calmly. "Learning more about Monica." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Jonathan's voice stayed quiet. "Because people who work that hard usually have a story." He paused. "And I've learned something about stories." Ethan crossed his arms again. "Oh yeah?" Jonathan nodded slightly. "The part you see first is rarely the part that matters." Outside, a winter breeze moved down the street, and somewhere in the distance, the consequences of the morning had already begun to move quietly toward them. The cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm after Monica and Annie left. Orders were called out again. Milk steamed, cups clinked softly against saucers. Yet the room carried a lingering awareness of what had happened. People had witnessed something uncomfortable, and people rarely forgot moments that revealed a person's character. Jonathan sat down at his table again. He hadn't finished his coffee earlier, but it had gone cold. He didn't bother ordering another one. Across the room, Ethan stood behind the counter pretending to focus on receipts and the register. But Jonathan could tell Ethan was watching him. After a few minutes, Ethan finally spoke. "So now what?" Jonathan looked up. "Now?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "You made your point. You embarrassed me in front of half the neighborhood." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "You embarrassed yourself." Ethan scoffed. "Sure." Jonathan rested his hands on the table. "I asked you a question earlier." "Which one?" "How long Monica worked here." Ethan shrugged. "Couple months." Jonathan watched him carefully. "That's not what the records say." Ethan froze for half a second. It was subtle, but Jonathan noticed. "What records?" Ethan asked. Jonathan tapped his phone once on the table. "The state labor database." Ethan frowned. "You looked that up already?" Jonathan nodded. "It takes about 30 seconds. Ethan crossed his arms. "So?" Jonathan leaned back slightly. "So Monica registered employment here 11 months ago." The air between them shifted. Ethan said nothing. Jonathan continued calmly. "That's a lot longer than a couple months." Ethan shrugged. "She took time off." "Why?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Jonathan studied him. "You don't know," Ethan finally said. "Then tell me." Ethan leaned against the counter. "She had problems." "What kind of problems?" "Personnel." Jonathan's voice stayed quiet. "Medical?" Ethan hesitated. "Something like that." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I thought so." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Jonathan slid his phone across the table. "Last year, Monica filed a temporary leave request." Ethan glanced at the screen. His jaw tightened. "Where did you get that?" "Public employment records." Ethan pushed the phone back. "So?" Jonathan spoke calmly. 3 months medical leave. Ethan didn't respond. Jonathan watched him carefully. Hospital records tied to the leave. Ethan sighed loudly. You're digging into an employee's life now? Jonathan didn't react. I'm trying to understand something. Understand what? Jonathan's voice softened slightly. Why someone who works as hard as she does almost lost her apartment. Ethan looked irritated. People fall behind. Jonathan nodded. Yes. He paused. But the story usually starts earlier. The older man in the tweed jacket near the window had quietly stood up and walked over to Jonathan's table. He spoke politely. Excuse me. Jonathan looked up. Yes? The man gestured toward the door. That woman who just left. Monica. Yes. The man nodded. I know her. Jonathan sat a little straighter. You do? The man pulled out the chair across from Jonathan. May I? Jonathan gestured for him to sit. Of course. The man sat down slowly. My name is Harold Bennett, he said. Jonathan nodded politely. Jonathan Reed. Harold glanced toward Ethan briefly. Then he lowered his voice. Monica used to work at the elementary school 2 blocks from here. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. As what? Administrative assistant. Jonathan frowned slightly. That's not a cafe job. No. Harold agreed. It isn't. Jonathan waited. Harold continued. She was very good at it. Ethan shifted behind the counter. Jonathan noticed but ignored it. What happened? Jonathan asked. Harold sighed softly. Her husband. Jonathan said nothing. He was killed 2 years ago. Jonathan's expression changed slightly. How? How? Construction accident. Jonathan nodded slowly. And after that? Harold folded his hands together. She raised that little girl alone. Jonathan looked toward the window where Monica and Annie had stood earlier. Harold continued. She tried to keep the school job. But, Harold shook his head. Medical bills. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. Whose? The child's. Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest. Annie? Harold nodded. Heart surgery. The cafe suddenly felt very quiet again. Jonathan spoke carefully. When? Last year. Jonathan remembered the employment record. 3 months leave. Hospital paperwork. Suddenly it fit together. Harold continued quietly. She almost lost the apartment back then too. Jonathan looked down at the table for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind. So, why is she working here? Harold glanced toward Ethan again, then back to Jonathan. She needed flexible hours. Jonathan followed his gaze. Ethan stood very still behind the counter now. Jonathan spoke slowly. So she came here after the surgery. Harold nodded. Yes. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. The pieces of the story were rearranging themselves now. Medical debt. Single mother. Flexible work. Unpaid wages. He looked at Ethan again. 11 months. Ethan didn't respond. Jonathan's voice was calm but sharper now. You knew about the surgery. Ethan finally answered. Yes. And you still delayed her pay. Ethan slammed a receipt book down on the counter. You don't know the whole story. The sudden anger made several customers turn again. Jonathan remained still. Then tell it. Doer. Ethan stared at him. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said something that changed the direction of the entire situation. She wasn't supposed to still be working here. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean? Ethan looked toward the door, then back at Jonathan. It means someone else wanted her gone months ago. The room felt colder somehow. Jonathan's voice dropped. Who? Ethan hesitated, and that hesitation was enough for Jonathan to realize something important. This situation had never been only about delayed wages. Something else had been happening inside this cafe for a long time. Something Monica herself might not even understand. Ethan finally spoke again. You ever heard of the new development project 2 blocks south of here? Jonathan nodded slowly. Yes. Half the block's getting bought up. Jonathan's eyes sharpened. Yes. Ethan leaned forward slightly. And guess who owns the building Monica's apartment is in? Jonathan didn't answer, but he already knew the direction this story was going, and it was no longer small. Jonathan did not speak for several seconds. The sounds of the cafe returned again, cups sliding across the counter. The low murmur of customers, but to Jonathan the room felt distant now, because Ethan had just revealed something far more serious than unpaid wages. A development project, property, and Monica's apartment building. Jonathan looked at Ethan carefully. Start from the beginning. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know everything. Tell me what you do know. Ethan glanced toward the customers. then lowered his voice. 6 months ago, a real estate group started buying properties around here. Jonathan nodded slowly. I heard about it. Yeah, Ethan said. They've been offering owners pretty good money. Jonathan leaned back slightly. For redevelopment. Exactly. Jonathan knew how these deals worked. He had invested in enough commercial projects over the years to recognize the pattern. Buy aging buildings, clear tenants, build something expensive, and change the entire neighborhood. He asked the next question carefully. Who owns Monica's building? Ethan hesitated. That's the problem. Jonathan waited. Ethan continued. The building used to belong to a retired couple. And now? They sold it last winter. Jonathan's eyes sharpened. To the development group. Ethan nodded slowly. Jonathan leaned forward. And the new owners want the tenants out. Most of them are already gone. Jonathan frowned. But not Monica. Ethan pointed toward the window. She's the last long-term tenant still holding a lease. Jonathan felt the pieces sliding together. Delayed paychecks. Rent due. Eviction pressure. He spoke quietly. So someone benefits if she falls behind. Ethan didn't answer. Jonathan didn't need him to. He already understood. Harold Bennett, still sitting nearby, looked troubled. I heard rumors about that, the older man said. Jonathan turned to him. What rumors? Harold folded his hands. That building is supposed to be demolished. Jonathan nodded. Most likely. But the developer can't start construction until every tenant leaves. Jonathan looked back at Ethan. And Monica's lease? Still active, Ethan admitted. Jonathan's voice dropped, which means eviction would solve their problem. Ethan gave a reluctant nod. Yes. Jonathan stood up slowly. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor. Harold looked up at him. What are you thinking? Jonathan looked toward the door where Monica and Annie had left earlier. I'm thinking someone expected Monica to fail financially. Ethan frowned. That's a stretch. Jonathan shook his head. No. He began pacing slowly beside the table. Medical debt. He raised one finger. Single parent. Another finger. Flexible job with delayed pay. A third finger. Then he stopped walking. And rent due at the same time. Ethan shifted uneasily. You're making a conspiracy out of coincidence. Jonathan turned toward him. Am I? Ethan didn't answer. Jonathan picked up his phone again. If a developer wants tenants out, he said quietly, they usually apply pressure. Harold nodded. That happens all the time. Jonathan continued. Rising rent. Maintenance problems. Legal notices. He paused. Or financial instability. Ethan frowned. You think I'm part of that? Jonathan looked directly at him. Were you asked to make things difficult for her? Ethan's eyes flashed. No. Jonathan studied his face. You're sure? Yes. The answer came quickly, but something about Ethan's tone still carried uncertainty. Jonathan noticed it. He stepped closer. Did anyone talk to you about Monica? Ethan looked away briefly, then back. Someone came in a few months ago. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Who? I don't remember his name. Describe him. Ethan Seahid. Suit. Real estate type. Did he mention the building? Ethan hesitated again. Yes. What did he say? That the neighborhood was changing. Jonathan waited. And? That people who couldn't afford the future probably wouldn't stay long. Harold shook his head quietly. Jonathan asked the next question slowly. Did he mention Monica specifically? Ethan rubbed his temple. He asked about my staff. Jonathan felt a quiet anger building. What exactly did he ask? Whether anyone working here lived in the building. Jonathan's expression hardened. And you told him? Ethan looked uncomfortable. I didn't think it mattered. Jonathan nodded once. Did he ask anything else? Ethan took a breath. He asked if she was reliable. Jonathan stared at him. What did you say? Ethan looked down briefly. I said she worked hard. Jonathan waited. And, Ethan swallowed, and that she needed the job. The meaning of that statement settled heavily in the room. Harold shook his head again. Good Lord. Jonathan spoke quietly. You told him she depended on this job. Ethan looked defensive. That's normal information. Jonathan's voice remained calm. To the wrong person, it's leverage. Ethan didn't respond. Jonathan walked to the window. Outside, the winter afternoon had grown colder. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalk with coats pulled tight against the wind. Somewhere out there, Monica and Annie were walking home. To an apartment that someone else wanted very badly. Jonathan turned back toward Ethan. Did the man come back? Ethan nodded once. Twice. And? He asked if Monica was still working. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. What did you tell him? Ethan hesitated. The truth. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. So he knew she still had income. Yes. And when her pay stopped, Jonathan said quietly, she suddenly couldn't pay rent. The connection hung in the air. Ethan looked shaken now. You think I helped them push her out? Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, I think you made it easier. Ethan leaned against the counter. I didn't know. Jonathan nodded slowly. I believe that. He paused. But someone else did. Harold leaned forward. Who owns the development project? Jonathan picked up his phone again. That's exactly what I'm going to find out. He typed quickly for several seconds. Then he stopped. His expression changed. Ethan noticed. What? Jonathan slowly turned the screen toward them. I know the company. Harold leaned closer. So, Jonathan's voice became very quiet. Because I've done business with them before. Ethan frowned. Is that bad? Jonathan looked toward the door again. Yes, he said. Very. Jonathan stared at the name on his phone for several seconds. The cafe around him faded into the background again. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Well, he asked. Who owns the project? Jonathan slowly turned the screen toward him. Barclay Urban Development. Ethan frowned. I've heard of them. Harold Bennett nodded from his chair. They've been buying properties all over the city. Jonathan slipped the phone back into his pocket. Yes, he said quietly. They have. Ethan studied his expression. You said you've done business with them. Jonathan nodded. Once. And? Jonathan looked toward the window again. It was enough. Harold leaned forward. What kind of company are they? Jonathan took a slow breath. Very efficient. That sounds normal. It would be, Jonathan said, if efficiency were their only goal. Ethan frowned. What are you saying? Jonathan walked back to the table and sat down. Barclay specializes in aggressive redevelopment. Harold raised an eyebrow. A lot of developers do. Yes, Jonathan said. But most of them follow the usual path, which is negotiations, buyouts, legal incentives. Harold nodded. That's typical. Jonathan's voice lowered slightly. Barclay prefers speed. Ethan crossed his arms. And speed often requires pressure. Harold understood immediately. I'm pretty sure. Jonathan nodded once. Exactly. Ethan shook his head. You're still assuming too much. Jonathan looked at him calmly. Let me tell you about the last project I saw them involved in. The cafe had grown quiet again. Even the baristas seemed to be listening now. Jonathan continued. 3 years ago, they redeveloped a block near the river. Harold nodded slowly. I remember that project. Most people remember the new luxury towers, Jonathan said, but they forget what was there before. Ethan leaned against the counter. What was there? 4 old apartment buildings. Harold's face tightened slightly. I remember that part too. Jonathan continued. Within 6 months, every tenant moved out. Ethan shrugged. That's redevelopment. Jonathan shook his head. Not exactly. He looked directly at Ethan. 5 tenants reported sudden maintenance failures. Harold frowned. What kind? Heat outages in winter. Broken plumbing. Electrical problems. Ethan said nothing. Jonathan continued. And 3 tenants suddenly lost their jobs. Ethan frowned. What does that have to do with the developer? Jonathan met his eyes. All 3 jobs were located in businesses owned by companies connected to Barclay. The room grew very still. Harold leaned back slowly. Are you saying they pressured employers? Jonathan shrugged slightly. I'm saying something interesting happened. Ethan looked uncomfortable. That's speculation. Jonathan nodded. Yes. Then he added quietly, but the timing was remarkable. Ethan rubbed his forehead. So you think the same thing is happening to Monica? Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a different question. How long ago did the man in the suit start asking about her? Ethan thought for a moment. Maybe 4 months. Jonathan nodded. And how long has her pay been delayed? Ethan froze again. 5 weeks. Jonathan looked at him calmly. After 11 months of steady work. Ethan didn't respond. Harold spoke softly. That's not coincidence. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. No, he said quietly. It rarely is. Outside the cafe window, clouds had begun gathering in the late afternoon sky. Jonathan picked up his phone again. Ethan watched him. What now? Jonathan opened an old contact list. Now I confirm something. Confirm what? Jonathan scrolled slowly through the screen. The person running Barclay's acquisition division. Harold frowned. Why does that matter? Jonathan stopped scrolling. Because the name had appeared. He stared at it for a moment. Then he said it out loud. Daniel Cross. Ethan frowned. Who's that? Jonathan looked up. Daniel Cross doesn't just buy property. Harold leaned forward. What does he do? Jonathan's voice became very calm. He removes obstacles. Ethan frowned. That sounds dramatic. Jonathan shook his head. It's accurate. He stood up slowly. Harold looked concerned. You know this man? Jonathan nodded. Yes. From business? Yes. Harold hesitated. And? Jonathan looked toward the door again. And Daniel Cross doesn't waste time pushing tenants unless something valuable is underneath them. Ethan frowned. What do you mean, underneath? Jonathan turned toward him. What floor does Monica live on? Third. And the building basement? Ethan shrugged. Old storage and utilities. Jonathan shook his head slowly. No. Ethan blinked. What? Jonathan spoke carefully now. I looked at the development permit last month. Harold leaned closer. What did it say? Jonathan's eyes sharpened. The new project includes underground parking. That's normal. Jonathan nodded. Yes. He paused. But the permit required unusually deep excavation. Ethan frowned. So? Jonathan's voice dropped almost to a whisper, which means they're digging for something deeper than parking. Harold looked puzzled. Like what? Jonathan turned the phone again so they could see the permit summary. Then he pointed to one line. Subterranean commercial infrastructure. Ethan stared at the words. I don't understand. Jonathan looked at him. It means fiber. Harold blinked. Internet cable? Jonathan nodded. A major data line runs beneath that block. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. So the land is worth more than the apartments? Jonathan gave a small nod. Much more. Harold leaned back in his chair. So Monica's building is sitting on top of something valuable. Jonathan nodded. Yes. Ethan swallowed. And she's the last tenant in the way. Jonathan looked toward the window again. Yes. The room felt colder now, because the story had changed. This was no longer about rent, or delayed wages, or even a struggling cafe owner making bad decisions. This was about a powerful development company that wanted one last tenant to disappear. Jonathan slipped his phone back into his pocket. Ethan spoke carefully now. What are you going to do? Jonathan looked toward the door again, where Monica and Annie had walked out earlier. Then he answered quietly, I'm going to call Daniel Cross. Harold frowned. That sounds dangerous. Jonathan gave a faint smile. It will be. Ethan crossed his arms. Why would he talk to you? Jonathan's smile faded slightly. Because the last time we spoke, he paused. I cost him $20 million. The silence in the cafe returned instantly. And somewhere far away, a powerful developer had no idea that the quiet man drinking coffee in a small neighborhood cafe had just decided to step back into his world. Jonathan stepped outside the cafe. The afternoon air had grown colder, and the wind moved sharply along the street. Cars rolled past slowly while people hurried along the sidewalks. Collars raised against the chill. Inside the cafe, Ethan and Harold watched through the window as Jonathan stopped beside the curb. He took out his phone. For a long moment, he simply looked at the name on the screen. Daniel Cross. The last time they had spoken had been 3 years earlier in a glass conference room overlooking downtown. That meeting had ended with raised voices, lawyers, and a deal that collapsed overnight. Jonathan had walked away. Cross had not forgiven him. Jonathan pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice. Then someone answered. Daniel Cross. The voice was smooth, controlled, and faintly impatient. Jonathan spoke calmly. Daniel. There was a pause, then a quiet laugh. Well, Cross said slowly. That's a voice I didn't expect to hear again. Jonathan watched traffic pass at the intersection. It's been a while. 3 years, Cross replied. You vanished after that stunt you pulled. Jonathan didn't react. You remember it clearly. Oh, I do, Cross said. $20 million tends to stay in a man's memory. Jonathan leaned against a lamppost. I didn't call to revisit old arguments. Then why did you call? Jonathan looked across the street. At the Maplewood block redevelopment. There was a short silence. Cross answered carefully. That's one of many projects. Yes, Jonathan said. But it's the one I'm standing beside. Inside the cafe, Ethan watched Jonathan through the glass with growing tension. Cross spoke again. And why does that concern you? Jonathan's voice remained calm. Because of a tenant in the last building on the south corner. Cross didn't answer immediately. Jonathan continued. A woman named Monica Alvarez. The silence on the line lasted longer this time. Then Cross spoke again. "You've been doing research." "Yes. That's unusual for you." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Not really." Cross's voice sharpened slightly. "What exactly do you want, Jonathan?" Jonathan watched a city bus pass in front of the cafe. "I want to understand why your acquisition team has been asking about her job." Inside the cafe, Ethan stiffened when he heard that through the slightly open door. Cross spoke slowly. "You're making assumptions." Jonathan shook his head slightly. "No." "Then what are you doing?" Jonathan replied quietly. "I'm recognizing a pattern." Cross laughed softly. "You always did enjoy patterns." Jonathan didn't respond. Cross continued. "Let me guess. You think we're forcing her out?" Jonathan remained silent. "That would be very dramatic," Cross added. Jonathan finally spoke again. "She's the last tenant in the building." "Yes. You need the property empty. That's how redevelopment works." Jonathan's tone didn't change. "You've been asking about her income." Cross paused again. "Where did you hear that?" Jonathan ignored the question. "And 5 weeks ago, her employer suddenly stopped paying her." Cross let out a quiet sigh. "You're stretching." Jonathan's voice lowered. "I know how you operate, Daniel." "Do you?" "Yes." Cross was quiet again. Then he said something unexpected. "You always were the only person in the room who paid attention." Jonathan waited. Cross continued. "That's why our partnership almost worked." Jonathan didn't respond. Cross spoke again. "So tell me something." "What?" "Why are you involved in this woman's situation?" Jonathan looked down the street where Monica and Annie had disappeared earlier. "Because she works harder than anyone in that cafe." "That's not an answer," Jonathan replied calmly. "It's enough of one." Cross chuckled softly. "You haven't changed." Jonathan's voice remained steady. "No." Cross paused again. Then his tone shifted slightly. "Let me ask you something in return." Jonathan waited. "Do you know why that building matters?" Jonathan answered immediately. "Fiber line access." There was a brief silence. Then Cross laughed again. "You really did your homework." Jonathan leaned against the lamppost. "I know the value of data infrastructure." "Yes," Cross said. "You built half your fortune on it." Jonathan didn't deny it. Cross continued. "That line runs directly into the financial district." "I know. It's worth hundreds of millions once the development is finished." Jonathan nodded slightly. "Yes." Cross spoke again. "And one small apartment building is standing in the way." Jonathan's voice stayed calm. "And one single mother lives in that building." Cross didn't respond immediately. When he did, his tone had cooled. "You're suggesting we're targeting her?" "I'm asking." Cross sighed. "Jonathan, we buy buildings. We don't manage people's lives." Jonathan answered quietly. "But you influence them." Cross laughed again. "Still moralizing, I see." Jonathan's eyes hardened slightly. "Still avoiding the question, I see." The two men stood in silence for a moment, separated by miles but very aware of each other. Finally, Cross said, "You know what your real problem is?" Jonathan waited. "You still believe the world should reward people for working hard." Jonathan looked toward the cafe window. Inside, Ethan and Harold were still watching. "Yes," Jonathan said. Cross replied calmly, "The world rewards leverage." Jonathan's voice dropped. "And right now you think you have it?" "Yes." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I thought so." Cross frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Jonathan pushed away from the lamppost. "It means I know something you don't." Cross was quiet again. Then he said, "And what would that be?" Jonathan looked up at the darkening sky. "You think Monica is the last obstacle?" "Yes." Jonathan spoke carefully. "She isn't." Cross's voice sharpened. "What are you talking about?" Jonathan replied quietly. "You are." The line went silent. Cross finally spoke again. "That sounds like a threat." Jonathan's tone stayed calm. "It's a warning." "About what?" Jonathan looked back through the cafe window one last time. Then he answered, "You should have checked who was drinking coffee on that street this morning." Cross didn't reply, because for the first time in the conversation, he realized something. The redevelopment project might no longer be his to control. Jonathan ended the call, and inside the cafe, Ethan felt the entire situation shift into something far bigger than unpaid wages. Jonathan stood still on the sidewalk for a moment after the call ended. The wind had picked up, pushing cold air down the street, but he barely noticed it. Because he knew something about men like Daniel Cross, they didn't like losing control, and they almost never accepted warnings quietly. Jonathan slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked toward the cafe door. Inside, Ethan and Harold immediately looked up. Ethan spoke first. Well? Jonathan closed the door behind him. He confirmed the project. Harold leaned forward. And? Jonathan removed his coat slowly, and he confirmed the fiber line under the building. Ethan frowned. So everything you said was right? Yes. Harold asked the question that mattered most. Did he admit they're trying to force Monica out? Jonathan shook his head. No. Ethan snorted. Of course not. Jonathan sat down at the table again, but he didn't deny it either. Harold sighed quietly. That's not surprising. Ethan crossed his arms. So now what? Jonathan looked at him. Now I stop the project. Ethan blinked. You make it sound easy. Jonathan's expression stayed calm. It isn't. Harold leaned forward. What can you actually do? Jonathan took out his phone again. Development projects run on financing. Ethan frowned. Loans? Yes. Harold nodded. Banks? Jonathan smiled slightly. Not just banks. Ethan looked confused. What else? Jonathan tapped the screen. Investment funds. Private equity. Infrastructure partners. Harold's eyes widened slightly. You're saying the project depends on investors? Jonathan nodded. Yes. Ethan stared at him. And you think you can scare them off? Jonathan shrugged slightly. I don't need to scare them. He paused. I just need them to hesitate. Harold looked intrigued. How? Jonathan typed a message quickly. Risk. Ethan frowned. What risk? Jonathan set the phone down. If a development project suddenly faces legal complications. Ethan's eyes widened. Investors get nervous. Harold nodded slowly. That's true. Jonathan continued. And if a project sits on hold for even 6 months, he paused. The financing structure starts to collapse. Ethan leaned forward. You've done this before. Jonathan gave a faint smile. Yes. Harold studied him carefully. You weren't exaggerating earlier. About what? Costing Daniel Cross $20 million. Jonathan shrugged. That was a small deal. Ethan stared at him. What exactly are you? Jonathan met his gaze. A man who understands leverage. The answer made Ethan strangely uncomfortable. Jonathan's phone buzzed. He glanced down at it. A reply had already arrived. Harold noticed. That was fast. Jonathan nodded. Yes. Who did you message? Jonathan turned the screen slightly so they could see. Harold read the name. His eyebrows rose. That's one of the biggest infrastructure funds in the state. Jonathan nodded. They're backing part of Cross's project. Ethan stared. And you just texted them? Jonathan nodded again. Yes. What did you say? Jonathan answered calmly. That a tenant dispute may delay construction permits. Harold leaned back slowly. That's enough to trigger a review. Jonathan smiled slightly. Exactly. Ethan shook his head. So the investors panic. Not panic, Jonathan corrected. Pause. Harold nodded. And delay. Jonathan finished the thought. And Daniel Cross hates delays. Ethan stared at him. You're really going to derail a multi-million-dollar development over one tenant? Jonathan didn't hesitate. Yes. Ethan shook his head again. That's insane. Jonathan looked toward the window. Outside, the sky had darkened. Streetlights were beginning to flicker on along the block. No, Jonathan said quietly. What? It's fair. Harold smiled faintly. That's a rare word in real estate. Jonathan nodded. Yes. Ethan was about to say something else when the cafe door suddenly opened. The wind pushed it hard against the bell. All 3 men turned. Monica stood in the doorway. Annie beside her. But something was wrong. Monica looked pale. Frightened. Jonathan stood immediately. What happened? Monica stepped inside quickly and shut the door behind her. There was a man outside our building, she said. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. What man? I've seen him before. Ethan frowned. Where? Monica hesitated. In this cafe. Jonathan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. When? A few weeks ago. Did he talk to you? No. She shook her head. He just watched. Jonathan spoke carefully. What happened today? Monica looked shaken now. He was outside the building when we got home. Annie squeezed her hand tighter. He asked my mom when we were moving out. The room went silent. Harold whispered. Oh no. Jonathan stepped closer. Did he say who he worked for? Monica nodded slowly. Yes. Jonathan asked quietly. Who? Her voice trembled slightly. He said he represented the new property owner. Jonathan already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. What was his name? Monica swallowed. Mr. Cross. The silence that followed was heavy. because the conflict had just changed again. This was no longer about pressure. Daniel Cross had just stepped into Monica's life personally. Jonathan's voice became very calm. "Did he threaten you?" Monica hesitated. Then she nodded. "He said things would become difficult." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them again, and the calm expression on his face had changed into something much colder, because Daniel Cross had just made a mistake. The cafe had never felt this quiet. Monica stood near the door, Annie gripping her hand. Ethan remained behind the counter, his face pale. Harold Bennett sat frozen at the table. Jonathan was the only one moving. He walked slowly toward Monica. "Did he touch you?" Jonathan asked calmly. Monica shook her head quickly. "No." "Did he follow you?" "I don't think so." Jonathan nodded slightly. "That's good." Annie looked up at him. "Are we in trouble?" Jonathan crouched gently so he was eye level with her. "No," he said softly. "You're not." Then he stood again. But something about him had changed. The calm patience that had defined his behavior all day was gone. In its place was something far colder and far more focused. Ethan spoke carefully. "That was Cross himself?" Monica nodded. "Yes." Ethan muttered under his breath. "Jesus." Harold leaned forward. "That means he's nervous." Jonathan nodded. "Yes." Ethan frowned. "Why would he show up personally?" Jonathan answered quietly. "Because the financing just froze." Ethan blinked. "Already?" Jonathan held up his phone. The screen displayed a new message from the investment fund. "Project under review. Capital release paused." Harold exhaled slowly. That was fast. Jonathan slipped the phone back into his pocket. Daniel Cross just lost leverage. Ethan stared at him. "And now he's trying intimidation." Jonathan nodded once. "Yes." Monica looked frightened again. "I didn't mean to cause problems." Jonathan turned toward her. "You didn't." "But he said." Jonathan raised a hand gently. "Listen to me." She stopped speaking. "You didn't cause this." Monica looked uncertain. Jonathan continued. "Some men believe power means pushing people who have less." He paused. "But they forget something." "What?" Annie asked. Jonathan looked at her. "They forget that sometimes the person standing beside the smaller one has more power than they do." The cafe door suddenly opened again. Everyone turned. A tall man in a dark coat stepped inside. His expression was controlled, confident, cold. Ethan whispered, "Oh no." Jonathan didn't move, because he already knew who it was. Daniel Cross. Cross looked around the cafe slowly until his eyes settled on Jonathan. "Well," he said calmly, "I see you've been busy." Jonathan replied just as calmly. "You came quickly." Cross walked farther inside. "I was already in the neighborhood," Harold muttered quietly. Of course he was. Cross stopped a few feet away. His eyes flicked briefly toward Monica and Annie, then back to Jonathan. "You're interfering with a development project." Jonathan shrugged slightly. "You're harassing a tenant." Cross smiled faintly. "That's a strong accusation." Jonathan didn't blink. "You approached her personally." Cross's smile faded. "I was introducing myself." Monica's voice shook. "You said things would get difficult." Cross glanced at her. "I said redevelopment can be disruptive." Jonathan's tone hardened slightly. "Careful." Cross turned back to him. "Or what?" Jonathan stepped forward. For the first time all evening, the tension in the room felt like something physical. "You know who the investors are?" Jonathan said quietly. Cross smirked. "Yes." "You also know what they do when legal risk appears." Cross didn't answer. Jonathan continued. "They freeze capital." Cross's jaw tightened slightly. "That pause won't last." Jonathan nodded. "No." He paused. "But the investigation will." Cross stared at him. "What investigation?" Jonathan took out his phone again. "The one I just triggered." Ethan blinked. "You what?" Jonathan held the screen up. A new email had arrived from the city's housing authority. Tenant harassment complaint filed. Review initiated. Cross's expression changed instantly. "You didn't." Jonathan met his gaze. "I did," Harold whispered under his breath. "Oh my." Jonathan continued calmly. "When a developer pressures a tenant during a pending redevelopment." He paused. "The city tends to ask questions." Cross's voice dropped. "You're playing a dangerous game." Jonathan nodded slightly. "Yes." Then he added, "But I'm better at it." The two men stood facing each other. Years of experience, billions in potential profit, and one small apartment building between them. Cross finally looked toward Monica again, then toward Annie. Something in his calculation changed. He turned back to Jonathan. You're going to stop $100 million project for them? Jonathan answered without hesitation. Yes. Cross studied him for several seconds. Then he laughed once, quietly. You always were impossible. Jonathan didn't smile. Cross adjusted his coat. This isn't over. Jonathan nodded. I know. Cross walked toward the door, but before leaving, he stopped beside Monica. For a moment she stiffened. Cross looked down at Annie, then back at Jonathan. You win this round, he said. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The bell above the door rang softly as it closed. The cafe remained silent for several seconds. Finally, Ethan exhaled. Did that really just happen? Jonathan sat down again. Yes. Harold shook his head in amazement. You stopped him? Jonathan looked toward Monica. No, he said quietly. She did. Monica looked confused. I didn't do anything. Jonathan smiled gently. You kept going. He gestured toward Annie. That's harder than anything I did today. Annie looked proud of her mother. Monica's eyes filled again. But what about the building? She asked. Jonathan leaned back slightly. The city investigation will freeze the redevelopment permit. For how long? Jonathan shrugged. Months. Ethan stared. Which means the investors wait. Harold nodded. And Cross loses money every day. Jonathan smiled faintly. Yes. Monica took a slow breath. So we're safe? Jonathan looked at her kindly. Yes. Then Annie asked the final question. Will you still visit our cafe? Jonathan glanced around the room. Ethan looked embarrassed but hopeful. Harold smiled. Jonathan chuckled softly. I think I will. Outside, the night settled quietly over the street. Inside the cafe, the tension that had filled the day finally began to lift. And somewhere across the city, a powerful developer had just learned an expensive lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent in the room is the quiet man who decides to stand up. This story reminds us that true strength is not always loud or powerful. Sometimes it appears in the quiet courage of people who refuse to give up, even when life becomes unfair. Monica kept working, not because life was easy, but because she loved her child and believed tomorrow could still be better. Jonathan's actions show another lesson. When people with power choose to stand beside those who are vulnerable, justice becomes possible. In a world that often rewards money and influence, this story reminds us that integrity, compassion, and the courage to defend what is right can still change someone's life. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.